Hi everyone, welcome back. So in this video, we're talking about how policy actually goes from an idea, right, in some member's brain or some lobbyist's brain or some constituent's brain, and actually then the process by which it might actually become a law and policy. And right, this opening image is kind of a reference to the Schoolhouse Rock video that you may be familiar with, you may have seen, right, about how a bill becomes law, in which a cartoon, right, attempts to become law, and all the kind of the pieces of the journey where it might fall apart. And when we talk about the rules here, when you think about this process, there's lots. So don't get bogged down in the nitty-gritty details of everything here. But there are many places, right, where the rules, right, are kind of stacked against a piece of legislation, actually making it past that stage. And we'll talk about how and why. And the first thing to note is that the House and Senate, right, get to set up their own internal rules for how they operate, right, how they proceed with legislation and getting things done. All right, our Constitution does specify, right, the exact process by which, right, a veto occurs, and a few other pieces, but generally the whole idea of committees, the whole idea of internal structures of the House and Senate just aren't in the Constitution. And so something then that's very important to put up front is these rules matter a lot for how policy gets passed, except sometimes they don't, right? Is because the majority in the chamber, right, can rewrite the rules, right, or suspend the rules or change exactly how things are considered. There are some places, right, where this is kind of more or less true, but many of these policies, or sorry, many of these rules of how the chambers operate, right, can be bypassed, right, and particularly in kind of this era of steep divisions between the parties, it may be important to, right, so you can get it done without the other party kind of messing it up. So here's our friend Bill, right, and let's talk about his journey. Right. So the first place is some idea has to come up, right? Some bill, some policy, right, has to be written down that could be enacted by the chambers. And so the first question is who wrote it, right? And many times, right, it's members and their staffs, right? So they employ people, right, that are policy experts or kind of or committee staff of the two parties. Various interest groups often have many ideas, right, and offer kind of suggest language, right, or kind of are active in this process. The White House or other kind of actors, right, so the executive branch may get involved here. Various members of Congress may have their own expertise. You may see a lot of people with kind of their hands and ideas in the pot here. It has to be introduced in the chamber, right? So in particular, it has to be basically given to the clerk and given a number. Here, right, you can have not just the sponsor, but co-sponsors. So you can have a bunch of people sign on as essentially introducing the piece of legislation, right? No matter, some are very popular, right? Essentially a whole party is on it. Others, you only have one person. And there's only one real big restriction here, right? So bills that raise revenue, that is, right, collect money for the government, so raising taxes, right, have to begin in the House. Otherwise, legislation can be introduced in either the House or the Senate. So next, it gets referred to a committee. It gets sent to a group of people, right, that work on a specific domain and a kind of policy expertise. And it gets sent to a committee by the majority party leadership, right, with advice of the parliamentarian here. So importantly, right, the majority party can just send legislation kind of to basically a trash can. There's no trash can committee, but effectively to committees they don't think it will have a good chance of getting out, right, particularly because the majority party also has the majority in every committee. The committee chair then decides what to do. They're always of the majority party of the chamber. Typically the most senior member, although occasionally, right, people get passed up because this is a very powerful reward or punishment that the parties can kind of dole out if you're not doing what you should for your own party. And then it either gets a hearing at the full committee, right, actually gets to discussed, right, and talked about. You invite policy experts or other people in to discuss its merits. Could get referred down to a subcommittee, right, so the committees within the committees, because sometimes the committees are quite broad in terms of the topics they have. Right, so for example, the Senate, there's a committee called HELP, for short, right, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, right, and of course there are subcommittees for basically each of those individual topics within it. Or you just don't schedule it, and Bill dies. And that's the end of the story. Legislation doesn't move past that point. So then what happens? Well, then you have hearings. I mean, experts testify if it did get scheduled, and then markup occurs, right, where the legislation is amended, right? You have various kind of language changed in it, right, depending on what the expert said, depending on what members of Congress want during this process. And also during markup, the legislation could be tabled, right, if some compromise is unable to be reached or you have many people in the committee against it, right, and it gets set aside and basically it dies there, right, it doesn't get brought up again in Congress. Right, and then, right, it is finalized and then sent to the floor of that particular chamber to be scheduled to be voted on. And of course, the schedule may take a while and it may not be brought up, right, immediately by the kind of party leadership. So, right, then what happens? Well, in the House, right, it has to do a number of other things. In particular, it has to go to the Appropriations Committee if it requires any money to be appropriated for it, which most policies do, even if they're simply regulatory because you have to fund an agency or task an agency with this. It has to also go to the Rules Committee, where the rules are set on how this bill will be considered before the floor, effectively kind of a post-it note on the top of legislation saying how the legislation is going to be considered, whether open, where anyone can offer an amendment on the floor and continue modifying it, right? Restricted, restricting. There are a number of kind of special kind of restrictions you can put on it, but basically only germane amendments, so only relevant amendments, and some other possible restrictions. And there's some special rules for that you could also have here, right? Or closed rule, where essentially no amendments are able to be offered and debate is very limited on the floor. In the modern polarized era, we see a lot of closed rule because it allows the majority party to kind of push through or shove through, right, their policy without it getting messed up by the minority party on the floor. In the Senate, it's important to note that things operate a little bit differently because you've got only 100 people instead of hundreds. Often, the Senate operates by unanimous consent, right, meaning that everyone is on the same page, right, and is basically consented to how things will be brought up. Right? These are often negotiated by the majority and minority party leadership together about how things will be considered. Occasionally, though, people don't offer unanimous consent, and so you have to do the long, kind of arduous process of normal Senate procedure. So this is why even a number of Republicans are not super big fans of Rand Paul or Ted Cruz, for example, because they occasionally violate these. And then, of course, in the Senate, right, you have to think, right, about the vote, is that in order to kind of have a vote, you need to have debate end. And a filibuster can be used to basically indefinitely extend debate. There's lots of specific rules, and the textbook talks about these in detail, right, where essentially you're delaying, right, the ability for a vote to happen on a particular piece of legislation or a nomination or something. And so you might then have to file cloture, which is effectively is a motion to end debate, right, which takes 60 votes, which it means that considering legislation in the Senate is somewhat supermajoritarian. That is, in order to get something through, and there are a few exceptions, right, for kind of various kind of really complex issues here, you need 60 votes to get anything done, right? So it takes more than a majority to get something through the Senate. And then, pretty simple, it's a floor vote. Right? Do people vote yay or nay? This is recorded. I mean, it could be done by voice, but most often they're recorded in the House through an electronic voting system, through the Senate by calling roll, essentially, and asking. If it's passed, then it has to go to the other chamber, and you basically restart this whole process. And until it's passed in identical form, right? And then, right, if it's passed by both the House and Senate in identical form, it goes to the president. But if not, it goes to a conference committee to hammer out the differences, to kind of negotiate, right, how you might make the House version and the Senate version look similar. And then it has to go back to both chambers to get passed in final version, right? And you can see how this can take quite a while because the differences between the chambers might mean it takes a while for things to be negotiated. And at any point in this process, it can just stop if there's no compromise that's reached. Finally, then, it makes it to the president's desk. And there are only two options, really, the president has. The president can sign it, and it becomes a law, right? And then we'll talk next week when we talk about the presidency about a signing statement. So the president can add his or her interpretation of the legislation kind of on top of it, right? Trying to essentially modifying it, but not actually modifying how the bill is interpreted. Can return it, right, unsigned, right? And this is effectively a veto. Right. And 2/3 of the House and Senate can vote for it again, and the veto can be overridden. But if Congress is adjourned before this 10 days are up, this is referred to as a pocket veto. But effectively, the president either signs it or sends it back to Congress. And it's rare because you can know how the votes will break down, right, for vetoes to be overridden, but it does occasionally occur. And often, as we'll talk about next week, the threat of a veto from the president means that the House and Senate are likely already taking into account the president's wishes before it gets to his or her desk. So then at the end of this process, if it's signed by the president, you can see the president's name scrawled on the top of our bill here, who badge magically changed to law, right? Only 3% or less than 3% typically make it of the 5,000 per year or so pieces of legislation that get introduced. And we can see this, right, in this table, right? So every session of Congress is 2 years. So we can see the current session is the 116th session, right? And the important number here, or kind of the important place to look, is the number in the very rightmost column next to the total, because this is legislation that effectively never fits in one of the categories further to the left, right? So it's legislation that has essentially died, right? And it's typically 80-90% or more here. We can see vetoed bills with an override, without an override, right? So in current Congress, Trump has vetoed 6 pieces of legislation, right? 20 have failed in a floor vote, right? Only 5% actually got a vote on the floor, right? A number of these were resolutions, so not actually binding laws, right? But kind of whether symbolic or congratulatory or these other kind of things here that are not binding. And only 1%, right, are enacted laws that actually change, right, the laws of the country. So you can see very few pieces of legislation make it through. And this is not just something kind of in the modern Congress, right? It has shifted over time, right? But importantly, most legislation fails at some point in this process. So with that, thanks so much for listening.